The year was 1943, and the war in the Pacific was grinding through its bloodiest chapters. While young men fell from the sky in burning fighters over distant islands, back home in Burbank, California, another battle was being fought on the factory floor. This is the story of how one woman's simple twist of wire changed the course of aerial combat, and how the men who dismissed her almost cost us the war. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible true stories from history. The Lockheed plant stretched across acres of California desert, a sprawling fortress of corrugated metal and concrete where the roar of machinery never stopped. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the assembly lines churned out P-38 Lightnings, those distinctive twin-boomed fighters that pilots called fork-tailed devils. The factory floor was a maze of metal and noise where sparks flew like fireflies, and the smell of hot rivets and machine oil hung thick in the air. Overhead cranes moved like giant metallic birds, carrying fuselage sections and wing assemblies from one station to another. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and marked with yellow safety lines that workers had learned to navigate without thinking. The building itself was a marvel of wartime construction, erected in record time when the government contracts started flooding in after Pearl Harbor. Massive skylights had been painted over for blackout protection, replaced by harsh fluorescent tubes that cast everything in a flat, shadowless light. The walls were covered with propaganda posters showing determined workers and brave soldiers, reminding everyone that production quotas weren't just numbers, they were lives saved and battles won. Sarah Mitchell was 19 years old with calloused hands and dark circles under her eyes from working double shifts. Her fingernails were perpetually rimmed with grease no amount of scrubbing could remove, and her blonde hair, once her pride, was now permanently flattened from hours under a work scarf. She'd developed a slight squint from focusing on tiny wire connections in dim light, and her back ached constantly from bending over tail assemblies. But she never complained, not when boys younger than her were dying in places she couldn't pronounce. She'd come to California from a small town in Nebraska 6 months earlier, answering the call that echoed across every radio and newspaper in America. The men were overseas fighting, and the women needed to step up. Her older brother Tommy was a pilot in the Pacific, flying one of the very planes she helped build, and that knowledge drove her through every exhausting hour. The journey from Nebraska had been her first time leaving home, her first time on a train that wasn't just going to Omaha. She'd traveled with 3 other girls from her county, all of them wide-eyed and scared but determined not to show it. They'd shared a compartment on the train, watching America roll past their windows, farmland giving way to mountains, then desert, then finally the sprawling coast. When they arrived in Burbank, the warm January air had felt like a miracle after Nebraska's bitter winter. Sarah lived now in a boarding house run by Mrs. Chen, a Chinese-American widow whose own son was serving as a translator in the Pacific. The house was packed with factory girls, 2 or 3 to a room, sharing a single bathroom on each floor. The walls were thin enough that Sarah could hear her roommate Dorothy crying herself to sleep some nights, missing her fiancé, who was somewhere in Italy. They ate breakfast together at 5 in the morning, standing around Mrs. Chen's kitchen table because there weren't enough chairs, drinking bitter coffee and eating whatever rations Mrs. Chen could stretch into a meal. The landlady was a genius with Spam and powdered eggs, somehow making them almost palatable. The boarding house had become a kind of family, these displaced women finding comfort in shared exhaustion and purpose. They celebrated birthdays with whatever sugar rations they could pool together. They read letters from overseas out loud when the news was good and held each other when the telegrams came. 3 girls had left since Sarah arrived, gone home after receiving the worst news a woman could get. Their rooms were always filled quickly. There was never a shortage of women willing to work. The morning of March 17th started like any other. Sarah clocked in at 6, her worn work boots clicking against the concrete as she made her way to her station in the electrical systems bay. The time clock was surrounded by dozens of cards, names of women she'd come to know over the months. Betty from Wisconsin, who could thread wires faster than anyone. Rose from Texas, who sang while she worked. Linda from Maine, who'd lost her husband at Guadalcanal, but showed up every day with a smile painted on her face. Around her, hundreds of other women moved with practiced efficiency, their hair tied back in colorful scarves, their coveralls stained with grease and metal dust. Some wore lipstick and rouge even at this early hour, a small act of defiance against the masculinity of the factory floor, a reminder that they were still women even as they did men's work. Others didn't bother, too tired to care, their faces bare and pale under the fluorescent lights. The radio played big band music between news updates from the front, and the women sang along when they could hear over the machinery. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade was playing as Sarah reached her station, and she found herself humming along despite her fatigue. The music was a lifeline, a reminder of normalcy in a world gone mad. During breaks, they talked about which movie stars had joined the USO, which bands were playing at the Hollywood Canteen. It was escapism, but it was necessary. Sarah's station was in Bay 7, a section of the factory dedicated to tail assembly. Her workbench was covered with spools of colored wire, crimping tools, wire strippers, and junction boxes. She had her own set of tools now, purchased with her first paycheck and guarded jealously. Good tools were hard to come by with metal rationed for the war effort, and a quality wire stripper could mean the difference between meeting quota or falling behind. The P-38 tail section she was working on that morning was designated number 2387, a number she'd written in chalk on the side. It would be gone by afternoon, replaced by 2388, an endless stream of metal bodies waiting for her attention. Sometimes she wondered about the pilots who'd eventually fly these planes, wondered if they were scared, if they thought about the people who built their aircraft, if they trusted the hands that had wired their controls. Sarah's job was to install the complex wiring harnesses that ran through the P-38's tail boom. It was intricate work, threading dozens of colored wires through narrow channels, connecting systems that controlled everything from the rudder to the gun cameras. Each connection had to be perfect. A loose wire at 30,000 feet could mean the difference between a pilot coming home or becoming another name on the casualty lists. Her supervisor, Frank Harrison, was a gruff engineer in his 50s who had been building aircraft since before most of his workers were born. He walked the line with a clipboard, checking every detail with eyes that missed nothing. His hair was steel gray, cut military short, and he wore the same blue work shirt every day, pressed and clean despite the factory environment. He'd been building planes since the barnstorming days, had worked on mail planes and passenger aircraft before the war turned the industry toward death and destruction. Frank had lost his own son at Pearl Harbor, and he carried that weight in the set of his shoulders and the hard line of his mouth. The boy had been a mechanic on the USS Arizona, trapped below decks when the ship went down. Frank kept a picture in his office, a young man in a Navy uniform smiling at the camera, frozen forever at 22. He demanded perfection, and he had no patience for questions or suggestions from the assembly workers. Every plane that left his floor was a monument to his son, a promise that no other boy would die because of sloppy work. The workers both feared and respected him. He never raised his voice, never had to. A look was enough to send someone scrambling to fix an error. He knew every blueprint by heart, could spot a misaligned rivet from across the factory floor. Some of the women called him the hawk behind his back, but they all knew that planes from his section had the lowest defect rate in the entire plant. When you worked for Frank Harrison, you did it right, or you didn't work for him at all. Around 10 that morning, Sarah noticed something. She'd been installing the same harness configuration for months, routing the control wires along the starboard side of the tail boom assembly. Her hands knew the work so well, she could almost do it blindfolded, fingers moving automatically through the familiar sequence. Thread the main bundle through the access port, secure it with clips at stations A, B, and C, route the secondary lines through the support channels, crimp the connections at the junction box. But as she worked, she kept catching her sleeve on a particular bundle of wires near the elevator controls. It happened 3 times in the first hour, always in the same spot. The wires were secured with standard clips, but the routing seemed awkward, forcing the bundle to make an unnecessarily sharp bend around a structural support. It was the kind of thing you'd normally ignore, just part of the job, an annoyance to work around. But something about it nagged at her. Sarah had always been observant, a trait her father had encouraged back on the farm. He'd taught her to notice when a fence post was leaning before it fell, when a cow was favoring a leg before it went lame, when storm clouds were building before the first drops fell. Pay attention to the small things, he'd always said, and you'll prevent big problems. That philosophy had served her well in the factory. She paused in her work, really looking at the wire routing for the first time in weeks. The bundle had to curve almost 90 degrees around a support strut, creating tension in the wires. It wasn't dangerous exactly, the connections were secure and would pass inspection. But it wasn't elegant either. It felt like forcing puzzle pieces together when they didn't quite fit. And in her months at the plant, she'd learned that awkward usually meant inefficient, and inefficient could mean problems down the line. Sarah traced the path of the wires with her eyes, following them from the junction box through the tail boom. If the bundle was routed along the port side instead, it would be a straighter path. Less tension, more flexibility. The change would be simple, just a matter of securing the wires differently. She pulled out her pencil and started sketching on a scrap of paper, working out the alternative routing in her mind. During her lunch break, Sarah sat on an empty crate outside the factory, eating a sandwich her landlady had packed. The California sun was warm on her face, a welcome relief from the dim factory lighting. March in Burbank was nothing like March in Nebraska. No snow, no mud, just clear skies and gentle warmth. She could see the San Gabriel Mountains in the distance, their peaks still dusted with snow, beautiful and remote. The outside area was crowded with workers on break, women mostly, but also the older men and the 4F guys who couldn't serve for medical reasons. They sat in clusters, sharing cigarettes and food, reading letters from home. Someone had a portable radio playing, and the news was grim as always. Fighting on some island nobody had heard of before the war. Casualty numbers that made Sarah's stomach hurt. She tried not to listen too closely. Her friend Margaret, who worked in the wing assembly section, sat beside her, showing off a letter from her husband in North Africa. Margaret was 23, married at 18 to her high school sweetheart, who was now driving a supply truck somewhere in Tunisia. She read passages aloud, her voice catching on the parts where he talked about missing her, about the sand that got into everything, about the men in his unit who'd become his family. "Sarah, you're quiet today," Margaret said, folding the letter carefully and tucking it back into her pocket like the treasure it was. "What's on your mind?" Sarah frowned, pulling a small notepad from her pocket. The notebook was a gift from Tommy before he shipped out, something to write down her thoughts, he'd said. Instead, she'd filled it with sketches and observations about the assembly process, little things she noticed that might or might not matter. She'd sketched out the wire routing she'd been working on, with a few tentative lines showing an alternative path. "It's probably nothing," she said, showing Margaret the drawing, "but I keep thinking about these control wires. The way they're routed now, they have to bend almost 90 degrees around this support strut. I was thinking, if we routed them along the port side instead and secured them with a simple twisted loop, it would be a straighter path. Less tension on the wires. Might even save a few seconds on installation time." Margaret looked at the sketch with little interest. She was a practical woman who followed the blueprints and didn't ask questions. Her philosophy was simple. Do your job, collect your paycheck, pray your husband comes home. Everything else was someone else's problem. "Have you shown this to Frank?" Sarah shook her head. "You know Frank, he'd probably tell me to stick to my station and not worry about engineering decisions." Margaret laughed. "That sounds about right, but if you really think it matters, you should say something. I mean, your brother's up there flying these things, right?" That thought had been nagging at Sarah all morning. Tommy's last letter had mentioned problems with his fighter's controls, a sluggishness in the rudder response that his crew chief couldn't quite diagnose. It was probably unrelated to her observation, but the possibility gnawed at her. That afternoon, Sarah did something that terrified her. She approached Frank during his rounds, her notebook clutched in her sweaty hand. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it over the factory noise. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say a dozen times, but now that he was standing in front of her, all those careful words evaporated. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice barely audible over the factory noise, "could I show you something?" Frank turned, his expression already impatient. The clipboard was tucked under his arm, and he had a smudge of grease on his cheek. Behind him, production was running at full speed, and every second of a delay meant falling further behind quota. "Make it quick, Mitchell. We're behind quota today." Sarah showed him her sketch, explaining her observation about the wire routing. Her words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other. She pointed to her drawing, traced the alternative path with her finger, explained how it would reduce tension and possibly improve control response. As she spoke, she watched his face harden, the muscles in his jaw tightening. She knew that look. She'd seen it before when other workers tried to offer suggestions. When she finished, there was a long silence. Frank stared at the sketch, his eyes cold and flat. Around them, other workers had slowed down, sensing confrontation. The factory floor had its own social dynamics, and everyone knew not to cross Frank Harrison. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her back. "Miss Mitchell," Frank said slowly, his voice tight with controlled anger, "do you see those blueprints over there?" He pointed to the engineering station, where large technical drawings covered an entire wall, each one marked with revision numbers and approval stamps. Those were created by aeronautical engineers with college degrees and years of experience. Men who understand stress loads and vibration dampening and control surface dynamics and structural integrity and 100 other factors you've never heard of. Men who went to places like Caltech and MIT who've been designing aircraft since before you were born. Your job is to follow those blueprints exactly as drawn. Not to question them, not to improve them. Not to think you know better than trained engineers. Is that clear? The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Her face flushed hot with embarrassment and shame. Several nearby workers had stopped to watch the exchange, and she could feel their pity and second-hand embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment. Several nearby workers had stopped to watch the exchange, their hands frozen over their work. In the world of the factory floor, this was as close to public execution as you could get. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I just thought—" "I don't pay you to think," Frank interrupted, and the words were like ice. "I pay you to build. You're a good worker, Mitchell. Fast, accurate, reliable, but you're not an engineer. You don't have the training or the knowledge to second-guess design decisions made by people who've forgotten more about aircraft than you'll ever know. This isn't a farm in Nebraska where you can just eyeball things and hope for the best. This is precision engineering. Lives depend on following the specifications exactly. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Sarah repeated, stuffing the notebook back into her pocket with shaking hands. Good. Now get back to your station. We've got 12 planes to finish today, and this conversation just cost us 5 minutes we don't have. Sarah returned to her work, blinking back tears of humiliation. Margaret caught her eye from across the floor and gave her a sympathetic shrug, but nobody said anything. Nobody wanted to draw Frank's attention. The other women near her station carefully looked away, giving her the privacy to collect herself. It was a small kindness in a harsh environment. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of mechanical motion. Sarah installed harness after harness, following the blueprints exactly as drawn, even as the awkward bend in the wires continued to bother her. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over while her mind churned with doubt and embarrassment. Maybe Frank was right. Who was she to question the engineers? She was just a factory girl, barely out of high school, with no training beyond what she'd learned on the job. But the doubt wouldn't leave her alone. That bend in the wires still felt wrong, still seemed inefficient. She kept thinking about Tommy, somewhere over the Pacific, trusting his life to the plane she was wiring. If that awkward routing caused even a fraction of a second delay in control response, it could mean the difference between dodging enemy fire and taking a bullet. It could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home. By the time her shift ended at 6, Sarah's fingers were cramping and her back was screaming. She clocked out in silence, collected her lunch pail, and walked out into the fading California evening. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It should have been beautiful, but Sarah barely noticed. She kept replaying the confrontation with Frank, hearing his words over and over. Not your job to think, just a factory girl. Follow the blueprints. That evening, she wrote a letter to Tommy, carefully avoiding any mention of her day. She told him about the weather in California, about the movie she'd seen last weekend, about anything except the doubt that was eating at her. She sealed the letter and addressed it to his squadron, knowing it would be weeks before he received it, if he received it at all. 3 days later, word came down from the Pacific that changed everything. A flight of P-38s had engaged Japanese Zeros over the Solomon Islands, and while the American pilots had ultimately prevailed, several fighters had experienced control problems during the engagement. The reports were technical and detailed, compiled by maintenance crews and flight surgeons. Pilots reported sluggish rudder response during high-speed maneuvers, a lag between control input and aircraft reaction that could have been fatal in a closer fight. 2 planes had been lost, though both pilots had managed to bail out and were recovered by Navy vessels. One pilot, a lieutenant from Ohio, reported that his controls had felt mushy during a diving turn, as if there was slack in the system. Another described a hesitation in the rudder that cost him a shot at an enemy fighter. These weren't catastrophic failures, but they were concerning. In air combat, microseconds mattered. The factory went into emergency analysis mode. Engineers swarmed over the production line, examining every aspect of the tail assembly. Work slowed to a crawl as each plane was inspected before being cleared to move forward. The atmosphere on the factory floor became tense and nervous. Workers whispered among themselves, wondering if something they'd done had caused the problems, if American pilots had died because of their mistakes. Frank Harrison looked 10 years older as he coordinated the investigation, his clipboard abandoned as he worked directly with the technical teams. He barely slept, running between the factory floor and the engineering office, reviewing specifications and inspection reports. His shirt was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. If planes from his section had defects, if men had died because he'd missed something, he'd never forgive himself. Sarah watched from her station, her stomach in knots. She wanted to say something, to show someone her sketch, but Frank's earlier dismissal still stung. Who was she to question the experts? She was just a factory worker, a 19-year-old girl from Nebraska who'd never even finished high school. But then she thought about Tommy, somewhere over the Pacific, trusting his life to the plane she helped build. She thought about those 2 pilots who'd gone into the ocean, who might have made it home if their controls had responded just a fraction of a second faster. That evening, instead of going home, Sarah stayed late. She found one of the test pilots in the hangar, a veteran named Jack Morrison who'd flown combat missions in Europe before being rotated stateside to evaluate new aircraft. He was a patient man, known for actually listening to the mechanics and ground crew, unlike some pilots who thought they knew everything. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said, approaching him carefully, "could I ask you something about the tail controls?" Jack looked up from the maintenance report he was reading. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Sarah showed him her sketch, explained her observation about the wire routing. Jack studied the drawing carefully, his experienced eyes tracking the lines she'd drawn. He walked over to a nearby P-38, climbed up to examine the tail section, then came back down with a thoughtful expression. "Show me exactly where these wires run," he said. Sarah led him through the access panel, pointing out the routing path and the sharp bend that had bothered her. Jack pulled a flashlight and examined the installation closely. He tugged gently on the wire bundle, testing the tension. "How long has this been bothering you?" he asked. "A few days," Sarah admitted, "but Mr. Harrison said I should just follow the blueprints." Jack nodded slowly. "Frank's a good engineer, but he's also stubborn as a mule. Come with me." He led Sarah to the engineering office, where Frank was still working despite the late hour, surrounded by blueprints and technical manuals. Frank looked up with surprise and irritation when he saw Sarah with the test pilot. "Jack, what's this about?" Frank asked. Morrison explained Sarah's observation and his own examination of the tail section. "I think she might be onto something, Frank. That bend in the wiring is creating unnecessary tension. In high-G maneuvers, that tension could affect the control response time. We're talking fractions of a second, but in a dogfight, fractions matter." Frank's jaw tightened. "The design has been reviewed and approved, Jack. We can't just change the routing based on a hunch from an assembly worker." Jack's voice remained calm but firm. "Then let's test it. I'll take 2 birds up tomorrow. One with the standard routing, one with Mitchell's modification. We'll run them through combat maneuvers and see if there's a measurable difference in control response." Frank stared at the sketch for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed heavily. "Fine, but this better not be a waste of time and resources. And if we're wrong, we're setting back production by at least a day." The next morning, 2 P-38s sat side by side on the runway, gleaming in the early California sun. One had the standard wiring configuration. In the other, Sarah had personally installed a modified harness using her suggested routing, securing the wires with what the mechanics were already calling Mitchell's twist, a simple but effective loop that kept the wires in a more direct path. The test had drawn a crowd. Word had spread through the factory overnight, carried on the whispers and gossip that flowed through the workforce like electricity. Workers from every section had found reasons to be near the flight line that morning. Margaret stood beside Sarah, squeezing her hand for support. Frank Harrison was there with his engineering team, clipboards and cameras ready to document everything. Even the plant manager had come down from his office, curious about the fuss. Jack Morrison walked around both aircraft with the methodical care of a man who knew that carelessness killed. He was 41 years old, a veteran of the European theater who'd flown B-17s over Germany before being reassigned stateside. He'd seen too many friends die in burning aircraft to take any test lightly. He checked every control surface, examined the wire routing in both planes, asked questions of the mechanics who'd prepared them. His flight suit was worn and patched, marked with oil stains that no amount of washing could remove. Sarah watched him work, her stomach twisted in knots. What if she was wrong? What if her modification made things worse instead of better? Frank would never let her forget it, and worse, she'd have wasted valuable time and resources while men were dying overseas. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about being right or proving a point. This was about pilots' lives, about Tommy and thousands of other boys depending on every piece of their aircraft working perfectly. Jack climbed into the modified P-38 first, settling into the cockpit with practiced ease. Sarah could see him running through his pre-flight checks, hands moving over switches and controls. The twin Allison engines coughed to life, their distinctive sound rolling across the tarmac. Blue smoke puffed from the exhausts as they warmed up. Then he was taxiing, the nose wheel turning, the propellers catching the morning light. Jack Morrison took the modified plane up first, running it through a series of aggressive maneuvers that tested every aspect of the control system. The Lightning climbed steeply, engines howling, pulling G-forces that would have crushed a lesser aircraft. Sarah watched from the ground with her heart in her throat, surrounded by a crowd of factory workers who'd heard about the test. She shielded her eyes against the sun, tracking the distinctive twin-boom silhouette as it carved through the cloudless sky. The Lightning twisted and dove through the desert sky, its twin engines screaming. Jack pushed it through barrel rolls, split S maneuvers, high-speed dives, and pulling climbs that tested the control surfaces to their limits. He flew it like he was in combat, throwing the aircraft through violent evasive maneuvers that would have shaken apart a lesser plane. The crowd on the ground watched in awed silence, some of the women gasping at the more extreme maneuvers. This was what their work became, Sarah realized. This violence and grace and terrible beauty. The test lasted 20 minutes that felt like hours. When Jack finally brought the Lightning back down, the approach was textbook perfect, wheels touching the runway with barely a squeak. He taxied back to the flight line, and Sarah could see through the canopy that he was smiling, which had to be a good sign. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline coursing through her veins as if she'd been the one up there. When Jack landed, he was grinning. He immediately took the standard configuration plane up for comparison, putting it through the same punishing routine. This time, Sarah knew what to watch for, could see the subtle differences in how the aircraft responded. The second plane seemed just slightly less crisp in its movements, a hair slower to respond to control inputs. Or maybe that was wishful thinking. Sarah couldn't be sure. After landing the second time, he didn't even bother shutting down the engines before giving Frank a thumbs up. The difference is noticeable, Jack reported as the engineering team gathered around, his voice still carrying the edge of adrenaline from the flight. The modified routing reduces lag in the rudder response by approximately 0.3 seconds. That might not sound like much on the ground, but up there, in a turning fight with a 0 on your tail, 0.3 seconds is the difference between living and dying. In combat conditions, that's enough time to get your nose on target or evade incoming fire. The control feel is also smoother, less tendency to bind during high-speed maneuvers. There's a fluidity to it that wasn't there before. It's subtle, but it's real. He turned to Sarah, acknowledging her directly for the first time. Good catch, Mitchell. I've flown a lot of P-38s, and I never would have thought to look at the wire routing as a control response issue. But you spend all day working with those wires, you'd notice things a pilot wouldn't. That's the kind of attention to detail that wins wars. Frank examined the test data in silence, his face carefully neutral. The engineers were already taking measurements, photographing the modified installation, preparing technical drawings that would update the official blueprints. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out behind Frank's eyes, pride warring with the need to admit he'd been wrong. Finally, he looked at Sarah, who stood nervously at the edge of the group, still not quite believing what was happening. "Mitchell," he said gruffly, "good eye." Those two words, grudging as they were, meant more to Sarah than any medal or commendation could have. Over the following weeks, Sarah's modification was incorporated into all new P-38 production. The engineering department updated the blueprints, adding revision marks and notes. Sarah was brought in to demonstrate the technique to other wirers, teaching them the twist that would become standard practice. It was strange being the teacher instead of the student, standing in front of a group of experienced workers and explaining her method. The change was simple, taking less than a minute longer per aircraft to implement, but the impact was significant. Production actually sped up slightly once workers got used to the new routing, because the more natural path made the installation easier. Quality control reported fewer rejected harnesses, fewer instances of wires being stressed or damaged during installation. Pilots in the Pacific began reporting improved control response, particularly in the tight turning fights with Japanese Zeros where every fraction of a second mattered. Sarah received a commendation from the plant manager and a small war bond bonus. More importantly, she received a letter from Tommy, mentioning that the newer P-38s were handling better than the older models, though he didn't know why. Sarah smiled as she read his words, deciding not to tell him that his little sister was partly responsible for keeping him alive. But the real change was on the factory floor itself. Frank Harrison, to his credit, didn't let his ego get in the way of improvement. He established a suggestion program, encouraging all workers to report any observations or ideas they had about the manufacturing process. A large bulletin board was installed near the main entrance where suggestions could be posted anonymously if workers preferred. Within the first week, it was covered with ideas, some practical, some naive, but all of them showing that people were engaged, thinking, caring about the work beyond just meeting quota. Some suggestions were minor: a better layout for tool storage, improved lighting in certain sections, adjustments to brake schedules. Others were more substantial: alternative riveting patterns that reduced stress on airframe joints, modifications to painting procedures that improved durability, changes to quality control processes that caught defects earlier. Frank reviewed each one personally, and while he rejected many, he implemented enough that workers felt heard, felt valued. The atmosphere on the factory floor shifted. Workers who'd previously just followed orders blindly began asking questions, pointing out inefficiencies, suggesting improvements. Production meetings that had once been Frank lecturing his supervisors became collaborative sessions where ideas flowed in all directions. The plant's production numbers actually increased and defect rates dropped. Other sections of the factory began adopting similar programs. "Sarah, you started something," Margaret told her one afternoon as they watched other workers pin up their ideas. A sheet of paper with a suggestion about fuel line installation was being discussed by a group of mechanics. People are actually thinking now instead of just following orders blindly. You made it okay to speak up, to question things. That's bigger than just fixing one wire routing. Sarah shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just noticed something that didn't seem right." Margaret shook her head. "You did more than that. You spoke up even after being shot down. That takes courage." The war continued, brutal and grinding, for 2 more years. The Lockheed plant kept producing P-38s, each one incorporating lessons learned from combat and from the observations of workers like Sarah. The Lightning became one of the most successful fighters in the Pacific theater, with pilots praising its reliability and control responsiveness. Frank Harrison never became warm or friendly. But he developed a grudging respect for his workers that hadn't been there before. He still demanded perfection, but he also listened when people spoke up. He kept Sarah's original sketch pinned to his office wall, a reminder that good ideas could come from anywhere. Sarah worked at the plant until the war ended in August 1945. When the final P-38 rolled off the line and the factory began transitioning to peacetime production, she felt both relief and melancholy. The work had been hard, the hours long, but it had mattered. Every plane that flew, every pilot who came home represented a small victory. Tommy returned home that fall, decorated and older, with experiences he rarely spoke about. When he finally visited the Lockheed plant and Sarah showed him around, he stopped at the tail section of a Lightning and traced the wire routing with his finger. "This is different from the early birds," he observed. "Cleaner somehow." Sarah just smiled. "We made some improvements along the way." Years later, when historians wrote about the P-38 Lightning and its combat effectiveness, few mentioned the small modifications that had been made by factory workers. The official records focused on the dramatic missions, the ace pilots, the major design innovations, but the veterans knew. The men who'd flown those fighters, who'd trusted their lives to every rivet and wire, understood that victory was built from countless small improvements, each one made by someone who cared enough to speak up. Sarah Mitchell returned to Nebraska after the war, married a returning soldier, and raised 3 children. She never worked in a factory again, but she kept that commendation letter in a drawer, taking it out occasionally to remember those years when ordinary people had done extraordinary things. She taught her children that no job was too small to matter, that paying attention to details could save lives, and that speaking up, even when you're afraid, was sometimes the most important thing you could do. The P-38. Lightnings are mostly gone now, preserved in museums or rusting in forgotten salvage yards, but their legacy lives on in the stories of the people who built them, the workers who showed up every day and did their jobs with pride and care, who understood that every wire mattered, every rivet counted, and that victory was forged as much on the factory floor as in the sky above the Pacific.